You have a number and that's it. Society feels that we're animals. They feel that we don't deserve nothing but the execution.
June 26, 1885, a man about to be hanged claimed he was only 10 years old when the crime was committed. But no mercy was given. The trap fell, ending the life of James Arcine, believed to be the youngest death row inmate ever executed in U.S. history. These are the 10 youngest death row inmates in history.
It is therefore ordered that you shall be put to death by electrocution in the method prescribed by law, and that you shall be transferred to the custody of the warden at the Tennessee Prison for Inmates.
September 30th, 2026. That's the day Tennessee plans to execute Christa Pike, making her the first woman the state will have put to death in over 200 years. Christa Pike was once just another troubled girl looking for a better life. At 18, she entered the Job Corps program in Knoxville, hoping for vocational training and stability. But instead of finding a fresh start, she became part of a notorious murder case. Life for Christa had never been easy. Born in 1976 in Beckley, West Virginia, her childhood was riddled with abuse, neglect, and instability. She was exposed to alcohol before birth, faced sexual assaults, and struggled with substance abuse by age 12. And she had even attempted to take her own life multiple times. Growing up, she moved between unstable living situations, both giving and receiving violence, always searching for some sense of stability. Eventually, Christa landed in the Knoxville Job Corps program, where she met Tatterell Shipp. Together, they developed a fascination with the occult and grew close as a couple. But their relationship soon faced trouble when Christa became convinced that another student, Colleen Slemmer, was trying to steal her boyfriend. January 12, 1995, the tension boiled over. Christa, Shipp, and another friend, Shadala Peterson, lured Colleen Slemmer to an abandoned steam plant near the University of Tennessee campus. At first, they said they just wanted to scare her, but things quickly spiraled out of control. The attack lasted over 30 minutes, and the details are beyond disturbing. Colleen was beaten, slashed, and even had a pentagram carved into her chest. The final blow came when Christa smashed Colleen's skull with a chunk of asphalt. Not only that, but Christa also kept a piece of Slemmer's skull as a trophy and began showing it off around the school. And so it's not a surprise that Christa's arrest came quickly, just within 36 hours. The evidence was overwhelming, including the skull fragment found in her jacket pocket. When questioned, she confessed, but insisted they only meant to scare Slemmer.
During the interview, she's very giddy, laughed, very cooperative. She wanted to tell us all about it, but she was giddy. It was a happy thing for her. It was the greatest thing ever, and I've never seen anybody else like that.
At trial, all three faced charges, but only Christa was eligible for the death penalty. Her 17-year-old boyfriend, Shipp, was considered a juvenile, while Peterson cooperated with police for a plea deal. On March 22, 1996, a jury found Christa guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. She was sentenced to death by electrocution and received 25 years for the conspiracy charge. Since her conviction, Christa's life on death row hasn't been quiet. In 2001, she nearly killed another inmate, Patricia Jones, with a shoelace during a fire evacuation. She received an additional 25-year sentence for that attack. She also planned, but never executed, a prison escape plot involving a corrections officer and a man from New Jersey. That plan was thwarted before any real progress was made. For years, Christa lived in near-total solitary confinement as the only woman on Tennessee's death row. It took a lawsuit to gain her even basic privileges and more contact with other inmates. Meanwhile, appeals came and went. At one point, Christa asked to drop her appeals and requested execution, only to change her mind later. Despite numerous attempts, including a recent effort citing her mental health and new juvenile offender laws, judges consistently ruled against her. Throughout the legal battles, the question of age remained present. If Christa had committed the crime just 1 year earlier, as a 17-year-old, she wouldn't have been eligible for the death penalty. Her co-defendant, Shipp, now eligible for parole, was just 1 year younger and escaped execution. As her execution date approaches, the controversy grows. Advocates point to her tragic upbringing, mental health struggles, and unique position as proof that death isn't the answer. They note that nearly 200 other women convicted of first-degree murder didn't receive the death penalty. But for now, Christa remains on track to be the first woman executed in Tennessee in over 2 centuries.
There is nobody that's going to take me out of this prison and send me to Disneyland to live.
Maybe we need to ask what it really means to take a life at 18 and then spend decades waiting to lose your own. But after all, Christa Pike's story doesn't end at the execution chamber because she wasn't the only juvenile the system decided was old enough to die. Next is a boy even younger, and a case that forces an even darker question: how young is too young for death row? April 9th, 1981. 17-year-old Frederick Lashley waited in the darkness of his foster mother's apartment in St. Louis, Missouri, holding a cast-iron skillet tightly in his hands. Minutes later, the sounds of a cane tapping and a familiar door hose penning would transform this ordinary evening into a moment that would mark Missouri's history forever. Frederick Lashley's life was marked by instability from the very beginning. He was born on March 10, 1964, in Missouri. Lashley's mother abandoned him at an early age, leaving him to bounce between relatives who provided little stability. His formative years were marred by severe physical abuse, leading to depression, heavy drinking by age 10, and weekly psychologist visits by age 11. Despite his troubled upbringing, he managed to finish high school and was considered to have average intelligence. For much of his childhood, his cousin, Janie Tracy, doubled as his foster mother, raising him from the age of 2 until he was 16. But by the time Lashley turned 17, he was homeless. Lashley's turbulent teenage years included brushes with the law and stints in juvenile institutions. His relationship with his foster mother, Tracy, became strained as his behavior spiraled out of control. Tracy herself was battling multiple health issues, including heart disease, diabetes, and a neuromuscular disorder that required her to use a cane. A brain operation had left a vulnerable spot on her skull, a detail tragically known to Lashley. In the weeks leading up to tragedy, Lashley's life continued to unravel. He spent his days on the streets, battling addiction and poverty, as his relationship with Tracy deteriorated beyond repair. On that April day in 1981, a month after celebrating his 17th birthday, Lashley made a fateful decision. He broke into Tracy's apartment, unscrewed the light bulb in the front room to cloak his intentions, and waited in the darkness with a cast-iron skillet. As Tracy entered her home and reached for the light switch, Lashley struck her, breaking the skillet in two. A struggle ensued, and Lashley, knowing exactly where to strike, plunged a butcher knife into the soft spot on Tracy's skull, the result of her previous brain surgery. The blade penetrated deeply, causing catastrophic damage. After the attack, Lashley took her car keys and the $15 in her purse before fleeing in her vehicle. Tracy, discovered in a comatose state, died 2 days later from her injuries. Lashley was apprehended just after midnight, driving the stolen vehicle, and immediately confessed, both in writing and on video. Lashley's confession left little doubt about his guilt. The details of his calculated attack shocked the community. Prosecutors charged him with burglary, robbery, first-degree assault, and capital murder. During his trial, Lashley's defense team argued that he was under the influence of drugs at the time of the crime, specifically PCP or angel dust. But evidence of his calculated actions during the crime undermined this claim. The jury quickly convicted him of capital murder, and on April 26, 1982, Judge Michael F. Godfrey sentenced him to death, making Lashley Missouri's youngest death row inmate. The case drew national attention due to Lashley's age at the time of the crime. His defense highlighted his troubled upbringing, his mental health struggles, and his lack of adult criminal history, pleading for mercy on humanitarian grounds. For over a decade, Lashley's case wound its way through the court system. Appeals focused on his age at the time of the crime and alleged procedural errors during his trial. His defense continually raised concerns about the fairness of his trial, particularly that he had been convicted and sentenced to death by an all-white jury and that procedural errors may have impacted the outcome. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, petitioned for mercy, but each appeal was denied, including a final petition to the U.S. Supreme Court, which was rejected hours before his execution date. July 28, 1993. 29-year-old Frederick Lashley was executed by lethal injection at the Potosi Correctional Center. In his final moments, Lashley reportedly held no grudges against the executioners, acknowledging they were simply doing their job. George Lombardi, a corrections official, later shared that Lashley had accepted his fate without bitterness. His execution marked a historic moment. It was Missouri's first and only juvenile execution since 1930. It also highlighted growing concerns about the appropriateness of capital punishment for juvenile offenders, a debate that would culminate 12 years later when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Roper v. Simmons, making it unconstitutional to execute individuals for crimes committed under the age of 18. But before the law began to shift, others were still moving toward death row, juveniles whose crimes and executions would test the meaning of justice.
I can't imagine what I could say today that could cause you to have any mercy on me whatsoever. But I know I didn't come here to ask for justice. I came here to beg for mercy.
February 4th, 1999, the air was tense in Oklahoma State Penitentiary as 29-year-old Sean Sellers, a former self-proclaimed Satanist, faced his final moments. He sang, "Set my spirit free that I might praise thee. Set my spirit free that I might worship thee." Just before lethal injection, his death would become a dark milestone in U.S. justice history. Sean Sellers was born in California in 1969 to a teen mother and an unstable alcoholic father. His early years were riddled with family separation and humiliation. Frequent moves left him isolated. By age 12, he was delving into Satanism and immersing himself in the fantasy world of Dungeons and Dragons. By 15, he chronicled his allegiance to darkness in his own blood, writing, "I renounce God. I renounce Christ. I will serve only Satan. Hail Satan." Sellers' spiral into darkness was extreme, and by age 15, he was performing daily satanic rituals, drinking blood, and self-mutilating. His mother and stepfather's constant traveling left him often with relatives, fueling his growing anger and sense of rejection. What's more, childhood trauma, including beatings by his mother and humiliation from extended family, set the stage for his mental decline. It was a dangerous cocktail of neglect, violent family culture, and occult obsession, and he mixed all that with amphetamines and marijuana. September 8, 1985, 16-year-old Sellers, with best friend Richard Howard, shot and killed convenience clerk Robert Bauer over a minor disagreement about beer. Sellers later called it an offering to Satan. 6 months later, on March 5, 1986, after days without sleep and in a haze of drugs, Sellers killed his own mother, Vonda, and stepfather, Paul Bellafato, as they slept. He tried to stage the scene as a break-in, but after confessing to his friend Howard, the truth came to light. At trial, Sellers claimed demonic possession. His defense pointed to Satanism, Dungeons and Dragons addiction, and ultimately multiple personality disorder. And while medical experts studying him later said he indeed suffered from severe mental illness at the time, a diagnosis that surfaced only years after his conviction. But the jury didn't buy that defense, and Oklahoma law hadn't yet created the life without parole option at the time. And so, fearing a short sentence, they chose death. Inside, Sellers claimed to have undergone a Christian conversion. He wrote poems and stories, spoke against cults, and spread awareness about Satanism, creating videos shown worldwide about the dangers of the occult.
I hate what I was. I will never be that person again, ever. I don't care if they kill me. I don't care if I live to be 1,000 years old. I will never be what I was before because I hate what I did.
Friends, strangers, and even prison staff debated the authenticity of his repentance. He maintained a confession website, wrote letters, and even intervened to save a fellow death row inmate's life. Some were moved by his transformation. Others called it manipulation. And then, years after conviction, Experts diagnosed Sellers with multiple personality disorder, now called dissociative identity disorder. Evidence even showed brain damage and long-standing mental illness that was presented at trial because medical tests for this disorder weren't available until later. Even so, appeals courts ruled the evidence came too late to reconsider his sentence, and despite international pressure and involvement from Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the American Bar Association, the execution went ahead. United Nations officials, Human Rights Watch, and world leaders condemned the decision. Sellers' case became a point of contention, as he was believed to be a 16-year-old murderer facing adult punishment. On execution day, Sellers spent time with friends, ate Chinese food, and calmly faced death. He left words for his step-siblings saying, "All the people who are hating me right now and are here waiting to see me die. When you wake up in the morning, you're not going to feel any different." His stepsister later said, "He addressed the fact that we would still feel the same. It is very presumptuous that he would know how we would still feel." Right before the end, Sellers sang Christian songs and declared, "Let's do it, Gary. Let's get it on," to the warden before the lethal injection. Sellers' execution at age 29 for crimes committed at 16 was the first in America for someone that young in 40 years. It marked a turning point, fueling debate about juvenile justice, mental health, and capital punishment. His case would eventually help shift legal standards, leading to a 2005 Supreme Court ruling protecting juveniles from execution. Today, Sellers' life and death continue to spark debate about justice, redemption, and the cost of killing young offenders. But if you think Sellers' descent into darkness and ultimate death was disturbing, wait until you hear the shocking story of this next youngest death row inmate. October 29, 1977, it was supposed to be a quiet Saturday afternoon in Columbia, South Carolina. But three boys, James Terry Roach, Joseph Carl Shaw, and Ronald Mahaffey, were about to cross a line from which there was no return. Roach was just 17 at the time, technically still a juvenile, but the events he set in motion that day would end up making him a controversial figure in American criminal history, a casse that forced the nation to confront the complex issue of capital punishment for juvenile offenders. 1960, James Terry Roach was born in Greenville, South Carolina. By all accounts, his teenage years were troubled. He'd already been through state reform school. He had a low IQ, measured between 75 and 80, and he may have already been showing early symptoms of Huntington's disease, a degenerative brain disorder that affects judgment and impulse control. But on that October day, none of that would matter to the victims' families, or to most South Carolinians who were about to learn his name. It started with the three teens drinking beers and doing drugs. According to later testimony, their plan was simple and horrifying. They wanted to find a girl to rape. What happened next remains one of the most disturbing juvenile crimes in American history. They pulled up next to a parked car at a baseball field outside Columbia. Inside were Thomas Taylor, 17, and Carlotta Hartness, just 14 years old, on their first date. Roach pointed a .22 caliber rifle at the couple, demanding money. Taylor complied. The boys took his car keys and forced Hartness into their vehicle. Back in the car, Shaw gave the signal and Roach shot Taylor, killing him instantly. They drove Hartness to a remote dirt road. There, all three boys assaulted her repeatedly. Afterwards, they forced her to lie face down on the ground inside a circle Shaw had scrawled in the dirt. She begged for her life, but Roach shot her several times in the head. Shaw fired one more round, ensuring she was dead. But that wasn't even Roach's first murder. 12 days earlier, he and his accomplices had kidnapped and assaulted 21-year-old Betty Swank before Shaw shot and killed her. Roach didn't try to run. He was shortly arrested, and on December 13, 1977, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder, criminal sexual conduct, kidnapping, and robbery. Evidence showed that Roach was mentally handicapped and likely suffering from Huntington's disease. But the brutality of the crimes overwhelmed any consideration of his diminished capacity. The judge acknowledged that Roach was under Shaw's influence during the crimes, but he still imposed the death penalty, saying it was warranted despite Roach's age and mental state. Roach's execution would have become a flashpoint in the debate over capital punishment for juvenile offenders. His case drew international attention and appeals from figures like Mother Teresa, former President Jimmy Carter, and even the United Nations. Advocates pointed out that Roach, with his low IQ and apparent neurological disorder, functioned emotionally and intellectually more like a 12-year-old than a 17-year-old. But the horror of the murders kept public opinion firmly in favor of the death penalty. The victims' families, from prominent Colombian backgrounds, became the faces of community outrage. Roach's defense team made every argument possible. They claimed executing him would violate international human rights agreements signed by the United States. They presented evidence of his mental impairment. They even noted that South Carolina's legislature was about to consider banning the death penalty for minors. But nothing worked. The governor refused to intervene, despite reminders of South Carolina's shameful history with the 1944 execution of 14-year-old George Stinney. And in the end, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, denied a last-minute stay. January 10, 1986, Roach was strapped to the electric chair at the Central Correctional Institution in Colombia. He seemed calm, giving a thumbs up to signal he was ready. His last words were for the victims' families. "May you forgive me, just as I know my Lord has done." Then he addressed his own family. "There are only 3 words to say. I love you." 2 one-minute bursts of 2,300 volts ended Roach's life at 5:16 a.m. He became the 51st person executed in the U.S. since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. And the first person executed for a crime committed as a minor in 22 years. When word of Roach's death reached the crowd outside, deafening cheers erupted from death penalty supporters, some carrying signs saying, "Let the juice flow." At the same time, about 20 opponents held a quiet candlelight vigil at the governor's mansion. Roach's death did not end the debate. His case became part of the national conversation that eventually led to the 2005 Supreme Court ruling in Roper v. Simmons, which declared the execution of offenders under 18 unconstitutional. And so, for the victims' families, Roach's execution may have brought some closure. But for the nation, his case remains a powerful example of why juvenile capital cases demand careful consideration, even when the crime seemed to justify the harshest punishment. Still, that decision came too late for others. The next young death row inmate would face execution while maintaining his innocence to the very end. November 8, 1984, in San Antonio, Texas, 17-year-old Ruben Cantu's life was about to take a dramatic turn that would launch him into the heart of Texas's death penalty system and cast lasting doubt on the justice of his sentence. Cantu's childhood was filled with instability. His parents separated when he was only 14, and his mother moved 20 miles away, leaving him to grow up with his father in a tough, crime-ridden barrio of South San Antonio. He was small for his age, struggled in school, and found himself running with the Gray Eagles, a rough group of local kids. By 15, he was already stealing cars for an organized ring, taking them to Mexico for quick cash, and regularly dodging police attention. But despite these troubles, Cantu had never been convicted of any serious crimes before November 1984. That all changed with a violent robbery gone wrong at a construction site. On the night in question, 2 workers, Pedro Gomez and Juan Moreno, were sleeping on floor mattresses, guarding the site due to recent thefts. Cantu, then 17, and his friend David Garza, only 15, allegedly broke into the vacant house with a rifle, intent on robbery. They took Gomez and Moreno's wristwatches at gunpoint and tried to take their cash. But when one of the victims reached for a hidden pistol, the situation exploded. Shots rang out. Gomez was killed instantly, shot at least 9 times, while Moreno was also riddled with bullets. Miraculously, Moreno survived, though he lost 1 lung, a kidney, and part of his stomach. The initial investigation didn't go smoothly. Moreno, hospitalized and barely able to communicate, was shown photo arrays that didn't include Cantu and didn't identify any suspects. 4 months later, the case went cold. But everything changed when Cantu shot an off-duty police officer, Joe De La Luz, in a barroom confrontation. This incident and Cantu's own admissions of involvement in other lesser crimes made him the prime suspect in the construction site murder. Suddenly, police renewed their focus on Cantu. Moreno was shown photo arrays multiple times, failing to identify Cantu twice. But after learning of Cantu's involvement with the police shooting, Moreno finally picked him out as the attacker in the third photo array. He later testified in court, securing Cantu's conviction. But even as Cantu awaited execution, he fiercely maintained his innocence in the murder. 4 days after his conviction, he wrote a note to the people of San Antonio claiming he was framed because he shot the off-duty police officer. The evidence against him was thin, for no murder weapon was found, and no physical evidence tied him to the scene. Years after Cantu's execution in 1993, at age 26, both key figures in the case changed their stories. Juan Moreno, the surviving victim, recanted his identification of Cantu, stating he was pressured by authorities to name him as the shooter. He revealed that officers had told him Cantu was surely guilty because he'd hurt a police officer. David Garza, Cantu's co-defendant, also came forward, admitting that he allowed Cantu to take the fall even though Garza was there with another boy that night, not Cantu. Even the district attorney who prosecuted the case, Sam Millsap, became a vocal opponent of the death penalty, saying he would never again seek execution based on such thin evidence and vulnerable eyewitness identifications. The jury forewoman also expressed deep regret, stating that with a little extra effort, they might have gotten the right information and prevented the execution of an innocent man. Cantu's final moments reflected the peculiarities of Texas's death row. He requested a single piece of bubble gum for his last meal, an odd request which was denied. When asked if he had a final statement, he simply said, "No, sir." August 24, 1993, his execution closed a chapter, one that continues to raise serious questions about the capital punishment system and the reliability of eyewitness testimony in death penalty cases. Cantu's case remains a stark reminder of the irreversible nature of the death penalty and the potential for tragic errors in the justice system. If you believe this case crossed a line, the next story goes even further, because this time, the state executed before the inmate ever reached adulthood. January 16, 1958, what began as a seemingly ordinary day in a quiet rural community in Box Iron, Maryland, would end in a brutal killing that sent shockwaves through the nation. The story of one of America's youngest condemned killers was about to unfold. At the center of this tragic case stood Leonard Melvin Shockley, a 16-year-old African-American teenager from Omar, Delaware. The Shockley family had moved to Omar after living near Box Iron for years, and Leonard's older brother, 23-year-old Harold, had just been released from jail on probation following a conviction for larceny. Leonard, out of work for 3 weeks and recently dropped out of school, was especially close to his older brother. Together, they would become infamous for a crime that would ultimately make Leonard the last juvenile executed in the United States for decades. On that cold January morning, Leonard drank nearly a pint of wine. Together, the brothers borrowed a car from a local dealer and dropped their sister off at a friend's house. While driving through Box Iron, Harold suggested they rob one of the small stores in the area. In his later confession, Leonard stated he had some money in his pocket that morning, and the robbery wasn't driven by absolute necessity, but by opportunity and poor judgment. Around 1 p.m., Leonard and Harold pulled their borrowed Chevrolet up to Sarah Hearn's country store. Sarah was a 39-year-old mother of 3, known for helping her neighbors. Evidence later showed that Harold stayed in the car while Leonard, armed with a knife, entered the store. When Sarah approached to serve the teen, Leonard punched her in the face, then stabbed her multiple times in the back and breast before cutting her throat. The attack's brutality was clear, but there were also signs of attempted sexual assault. Harold eventually entered, tried, and failed to open the cash register, then quickly joined his brother as they fled the scene. Despite her fatal wounds, Sarah staggered 95 feet from the store to her house, collapsing and dying in front of her stepfather. A neighbor witnessed the brothers' car outside and heard the scuffle inside. His prompt call led police to respond quickly. Blood evidence in the car and on their clothing, alongside their confessions, left little doubt about their guilt. Police arrested the brothers at their home 8 hours after the murder. Both confessed separately about their roles. Their cases were moved from Worcester County to Dorchester County due to a venue change, and both were found to be mentally competent to stand trial. Blood evidence in the car and on their clothing, alongside their confessions, left little doubt about their guilt. Leonard was convicted of first-degree murder and robbery, receiving the death penalty. Harold received a life sentence for aiding and abetting, as evidence suggested he was present but did not participate in the actual killing. Despite their youth, the legal system showed no mercy. Leonard Shockley was executed in Maryland's gas chamber on April 10, 1959, at just 17 years old, making him the nation's last juvenile executed until 1999. The Leonard Shockley case sparked debates about juvenile execution that continue today. His execution contributed to changing legal attitudes toward capital punishment for youth offenders. While his brother was eventually released, Leonard's fate marked a turning point in American justice. His story serves as a powerful and tragic reminder that youthful mistakes can sometimes bear the harshest penalties of all. If this tragic tale showcases the consequences of desperation and bad decisions, the next case on our list demonstrates that not all young criminals face the ultimate penalty, but some paid an incredibly high price nonetheless.
I mean, for maybe 10, 15 years into my sentence, I really didn't even understand what happened. Honestly, I sat and tried to figure it all out.
May 14, 1985, in Gary, Indiana, 4 teenage girls, bored, broke, and high on drugs, made a decision that would echo through American legal history. At the center of it all was Paula Cooper, just 15 years old, whose actions that day would make her one of the youngest death row inmates in United States history. Paula was born on August 25, 1969. Her lawyers described her as a troubled youth from a deeply abusive home, a chronic runaway who'd attended 10 different schools by the time of the murder. But by all accounts, on that spring day, she was the ringleader of 3 friends, 16-year-old Karen, 15-year-old April, and 14-year-old Denise. Together they made a dark choice that would change all their lives forever. Their target was Ruth Pelka, a 78-year-old Bible teacher known for her gentle nature and community spirit. The young girls knocked on her door, asking about Bible lessons, knowing the retired school teacher would let them in. Once inside, they attacked. First, Pelkey was struck with a vase. Then, according to testimony, Cooper stabbed her 33 times with a foot-long butcher knife, while the others either participated or acted as lookouts. Witnesses later testified Cooper seemed to lose control, shouting, "Where's the money, bitch?" and repeatedly stabbing Pelka as her friends reportedly begged her to stop. They left with just $10 and the keys to Pelk's old Plymouth. After their arrest, Cooper's behavior in detention only cemented prosecutors' view of her as a profound threat. She attacked guards at the juvenile center and reportedly bragged about her crime, showing no signs of remorse. In court, prosecutors painted her as a social misfit, beyond hope of rehabilitation. At just 16 years old, Cooper stood before Judge James Kimbrough, who would later admit his personal opposition to the death penalty. But Indiana law then was clear. The minimum age for execution was 10 years old. Kimbrough, facing political pressure and public outrage, sentenced Cooper to death in 1986, making her the youngest person ever sent to death row in Indiana. The decision sparked immediate controversy. Human rights groups both in America and across Europe rallied to her cause, presenting petitions with over 2 million signatures to the Indiana Supreme Court. Even Pope John Paul II made a personal appeal for clemency. The United Nations received another 1 million signatures protesting Cooper's sentence. As this international pressure mounted, change finally came. 1987, Indiana raised the minimum execution age to 16. But the law explicitly stated it didn't apply retroactively to Cooper's case. Then, in 1988, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional to execute anyone who was under 16 at the time a crime was committed. Finally, the Indiana Supreme Court, after considering both legal developments and mounting public pressure, commuted Cooper's death sentence to 60 years in prison. But the most remarkable part of this story isn't just the legal fight, it's what happened next. Bill Pelk, Ruth Pelk's grandson, had initially supported the death penalty for Cooper, yet over time he experienced what can only be described as a profound transformation. He forgave Cooper and became a leading anti-death penalty activist. Pelk wrote of his journey in his book, Journey of Hope, and worked to promote forgiveness and understanding, even visiting Cooper in prison 14 times. During her nearly 3 decades of incarceration, Cooper earned her GED, then a bachelor's degree, and began tutoring other inmates. Her sentence was eventually reduced due to good behavior, and on June 17, 2013, she walked out of Rockville Correctional Facility after serving 27 years. But freedom, sadly, proved overwhelming. May 26, 2015, just 2 years after her release, Cooper was found dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in Indianapolis. She was only 45 years old. It's clear that the weight of her actions and the years behind bars never truly left her. Shortly before her death, she wrote to her fiancé, "I have taken a life and never felt worthy." But let's be clear about the impact of this case. Cooper's situation changed U.S. law regarding juvenile execution. Her death at such a young age underscores the complex legacy of America's youngest death row inmates. Those involved in her attempted rehabilitation said she wanted to speak to young people about avoiding the path she took. She told Pelkey about wanting to give back and prevent others from making her mistakes. Tragically, she never got that chance. The legal, moral, and personal ripple effects from Paula Cooper's case continue to be felt in debates about juvenile justice, rehabilitation, and the death penalty in America. But her story is not the earliest or the most haunting. Decades earlier, the state would execute a boy so young that his case still stands as the darkest chapter in American capital punishment history. June 16, 1944, South Carolina's electric chair rattled to life. A 14-year-old boy, George Stinney Jr., barely 90 pounds, too small to fit the straps, sat on a stack of books. He was the youngest American executed in the 20th century. He was convicted of killing 2 white girls in a Jim Crow-era narrow courtroom trial, a conviction later proven to be a gross miscarriage of justice. George Stinney was the youngest child in a large African-American family living in the segregated mill town of Alcolu, South Carolina. The town itself ran on cotton and Stark Division, with railroad tracks separating black and white communities. March 1944, 2 white girls, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, disappeared while looking for wildflowers. Their bodies were found the next morning, and the search for a suspect began immediately. Within hours, police arrested 14-year-old George Stinney, accusing him of killing the girls with a blunt weapon. They removed him from his home, interrogating him alone for hours without his parents or a lawyer present. The police claimed that George confessed, yet they produced no written or oral record of this so-called confession. The only evidence was his supposed word, supposedly given under intense adult pressure. After his arrest, George Stinney's father was fired from his sawmill job. The family was evicted from company housing. Fearing for their lives, they fled the town. And George's fate was set, all alone, isolated from his loved ones and detained 50 miles away, denied any meaningful legal assistance or familial support. All the while, threats of lynching hung over his head. The actual trial lasted 2 hours with an all-white jury, standard practice when black citizens were excluded from the voting rolls and jury pools. George's court-appointed lawyer, a tax official more interested in his political career than justice, offered no defense or challenge to the prosecution. He called no witnesses. He didn't investigate the case. He was silent, absent, and negligent, leaving George with no one in his corner. Witnesses who could have proved George was innocent, like his siblings who were with him when the murders occurred, were never interviewed or called to testify. In 10 minutes, the jury found him guilty. Immediately, George was sentenced to die in the electric chair. There was no appeal, and there was no justice. That June morning, they strapped George onto the electric chair. His small frame was dwarfed by the heavy machinery built for grown men. The state used a Bible as a booster seat to lift him high enough for the equipment to fit. When the mask was secured, it slipped off, revealing George's terrified, tear-filled eyes moments before his execution. The entire process, from arrest to execution, lasted barely 3 months. It was a record of speed, prejudice, and systemic failure in a Jim Crow South thirsty for blame and swift punishment. George Stinney's execution remained uncontested for 70 years. It wasn't until 2014 that his siblings were finally allowed to testify, sharing that he was with them when the girls vanished. The court, after reviewing the long-hidden evidence, vacated his conviction. Judge Carmen Mullen declared that George was robbed of justice and due process at every turn. The court's historic decision didn't come with apologies or reparations. Still, it marked a small measure of justice for a family that had lived under the shadow of this tragedy for 7 decades. George Stinney's case has become a haunting symbol of America's failures in both racial justice and juvenile punishment. His story inspired novels, operas, films, and the award-winning Stephen King novel, The Green Mile. 2022, lawmakers in South Carolina proposed the George Stinney Fund, a bill that would provide $10 million to families of those wrongfully executed, seeking to atone for historic injustices. But for the Stinney family, no amount of legislation or posthumous corrections can erase the pain of what happened in that small room on June 16, 1944. What makes George Stinney's story more tragic is how closely it resembles countless others from the era, when black children were frequently the scapegoats for the white community's fears. Even with the historic 2014 court decision, Stinney's innocence remains emotionally charged, as some relatives of the 2 murdered girls continue to believe in his guilt despite all evidence. But for history, what remains clear is the absence of a fair trial, a competent defense, or any real evidence linking George to the crime. His death, by modern legal standards, was a state-sanctioned lynching. If George Stinney Jr.'s case disturbed you, the next story may be even harder to process. Because long before modern courts or juvenile protections existed, the system executed a child whose age and circumstances still defy belief. July 21st, 1786, back in Old Connecticut, 6-year-old Eunice Ballas never made it to school that morning. By 10 o'clock, her body was found face down beside a stone wall, marking the start of one of America's most disturbing juvenile murder cases. At the same time, Hannah Ocuish, barely 12 years old, was a Pequot Native American girl with a known intellectual disability. Orphaned and passing through foster homes, her life was marked by struggle and isolation. Even her mother's reputation worked against her in the eyes of the authorities. By modern standards, she was a child with profound challenges, yet those same challenges would see the full weight of the law crash down on someone not even yet a teenager. That early summer, Hannah was accused of stealing strawberries by Eunice Ballas. For weeks, resentment supposedly simmered. On the morning of July 21st, Hannah crossed paths with Eunice on the road to school. The official story at the time claimed Hannah lured Eunice off the path with the promise of a piece of colored fabric. Deep in the woods, out of sight, the violence began. Eunice reportedly suffered blunt force trauma to her head, bruises across her body, and ultimately, the killer then tried to stage the scene to look like a wall collapse, a desperate, childish ruse that quickly fell apart. When investigators questioned Hannah about the murder, she claimed to have seen 4 boys near the scene. But once confronted with the lifeless body of Eunice Ballas at the Ball residence, Hannah reportedly broke down and confessed. Her supposed admission detailed the events just described: beating, and feeble attempts to disguise the crime scene. But here's where historical doubts begin to creep in. That confession, according to modern analysis, may have been dragged out of an overwhelmed, frightened girl with mental disabilities. It wasn't made to a neutral party, and its validity remains a point of controversy centuries later. Hannah stood trial in front of Superior Court Judge Richard Law. She was described as appearing unfazed and calm, but this was little comfort for a community in shock. A 12-year-old standing trial for murder tested even hardened legal observers, and many present were reportedly moved to tears by her age and circumstances. Still, conviction seemed inevitable. Judge Law faced a brutal legal reality, the Murder Act of 1752. Under that British holdover, a mandatory death sentence by hanging was required, and no consideration was allowed for youth or disability. The judge said, "The sparing of you on account of your age would, as the law says, be of dangerous consequence to the public, by holding up an idea that children might commit such atrocious crimes with impunity." From that moment, Hannah sat in a cell awaiting execution. Her youth could not shield her from justice, at least as it was imagined in 1786. Reports suggest she was mostly unconcerned by the looming death penalty until the very morning of her execution. Witnesses described her spending that final day in tears, terror finally overwhelming the thin facade of childlike unawareness. December 20th, 1786, the crowd gathered. Hannah appeared small, frightened, desperate for someone to save her from the rope. Witnesses remembered her silently pleading for help with her eyes. She managed to thank the sheriff for his kindness. Those were her last words before climbing the scaffold as Connecticut's youngest condemned female ever. Her execution haunted the New London community. Even then, many questioned if a girl this age, especially one with clear cognitive impairment, should die for any crime. And while the record painted Hannah as a cunning, dangerous child, modern historical research calls many original claims into question. Her confession? Extracted under duress. The supposed motive? Thin and never truly confirmed. Even her alleged violence before the murder, supposedly established in court, hasn't held up to current scrutiny. In recent years, New London's NAACP and Connecticut historians have worked to re-examine Hannah's case. They're looking at her confession, trial process, and the role racism and disability prejudice played in her conviction. No one can bring Hannah back, but her case may still have one final chapter to write. Hannah Ocuish's short, tragic life reminds us how justice once failed the youngest and most vulnerable, and she wasn't the only one. November 25th, 1872, near Fort Gibson in Indian Territory. A young Cherokee boy named James Arcine and his older accomplice, William Parchmeal, fixated on a vulnerable traveler. Their target, Henry Feigl, just purchased at a nearby store and was headed toward Fort Gibson. Feigl never made it to his destination. James Arcine was born around 1862 within the Cherokee Nation. His early life remains mostly a mystery. At just 10 years old, by his own later admission, he became the center of one of the most shocking capital cases in American legal history. His partner in crime, William Parchmeal, was significantly older, a detail that would matter little in the eyes of the court, but everything to historians who would examine what happened next. That afternoon, Arcine and Parchmeal's original intent was simply robbery, but what followed was much more brutal. They ambushed Henry Feigl on the road, demanded his small amount of cash and his boots. Feigl resisted. The confrontation quickly escalated, and Arcine fired multiple shots into Feigl, and according to their own later confession, both men then crushed his skull with rocks to ensure he wouldn't survive. For their violence, the reward was pitiful, only a small sum amounting to about 25 cents, and Feigl's boots. Feigl's body was discovered along that lonely stretch the next day, riddled with gunshot wounds and severe head trauma, his boots missing. But evidence at the scene pointed to more than just a robbery gone wrong. It revealed a vicious murder by two individuals, one of whom was just a boy. Despite the brutality, the case went cold for more than a decade. Arcine and Parchmeal vanished into the vast, lawless expanse of Indian Territory. The 13-year gap between crime and arrest speaks volumes about the chaos of that era. With limited law enforcement and fractured jurisdiction between tribal and federal authorities, many crimes fell through the cracks. By 1884, U.S. Deputy Marshal Charles Andrews picked up the trail. New information forced the case open again. He arrested both men after securing confessions from Parchmeal, who attempted to shift most of the blame onto his much younger accomplice. Under pressure, Arcine confessed and fully admitted to firing the fatal shots. His young age at the time was never in dispute after this point. Their trial was held in Fort Smith, Arkansas, under Judge Isaac C. Parker, notoriously known as the hanging judge. Once convicted, Arcine's defense team desperately pressed the fact that he was only 10 at the time of the murder, hoping for a life sentence instead of the gallows. But Judge Parker, in accordance with federal law of the period, was unmoved. There was no minimum age for capital punishment at the time, and the precedent was clear. Clemency appeals went all the way to President Chester A. Arthur. Everyone was denied. The federal government had no tolerance for exceptions when it came to territorial justice. The fact that 13 years separated the crime from the sentence didn't matter. The fatal chain of events begun in 1872 had to be completed. June 26, 1885, James Arcine, by then about 23 years old, was hanged at Fort Smith alongside Parchmeal. Their last words were lost to history amid a heavy rainstorm and the general noise of another routine execution on Parker's gallows. Few witnesses could make out their final statements, and they were never officially recorded. Arcine's execution stands as a stark reminder of frontier justice and a critical benchmark in American legal history. At the time, there was no distinction for age in federal capital cases, particularly in the lawless territories. His case demonstrates the sharp contrast between contemporary juvenile justice standards and 19th century frontier law. While today's legal system would never impose the death penalty on someone this age, in Parker's court, such considerations were irrelevant. But Arcine's story is more than just a historical footnote. His execution for a crime committed at age 10 made him the youngest person put to death for a childhood offense in United States history. It marked the end of an era and eventually helped fuel debates that would lead to major reforms in how the justice system treats young offenders.